Hi, I'm Douglas of ShivWworks. I am a retired police officer that did 21 years on the job. The vast majority of that was spent in narcotics and SWAT. I teach in 40 states, 11 countries outside of the U.S., 3 branches of the U.S. military, 5 federal agencies. I am best known in the industry for attacking niche problems. What does a gunfight in a clinch or a ground fight look like? Knife work at really close range, fighting in cars, and solo structure movement problems. So I'm going to work with you today on several problems involving clinch and ground fight, deploying weapons or keeping weapons from coming out. So the clinch is a very live range of fighting. It's a range that's defined by pressure, attachment, and a wild entanglement of limbs. So when I mean clinch, if I were using Andrew right here, what I mean is we're in this range where he can touch me and I can touch him. That could be any semblance of hugging, grabbing. Usually guys are throwing punches and things like that. So it's a very dangerous range because Andrew can access anything on his waist. He can access anything on my waist. We can both pick each other up and take each other to the ground. He can strike me. It's probably the most live range of combat that we can actually be forced into. So we really want to know how to manage this. Now, a primary strategy that we're going to have is exiting the clinch. Why? Because it's a much safer place to deploy weapons from. So let's talk about some problems historically we see in the real world with people trying to manage this range. First of all, very common in dash cam video and surveillance video, we'll see an armed professional, a police officer, get into this range, and maybe he's getting the worst of it. Maybe he's getting punched, maybe he's dealing with somebody bigger, younger, stronger. Here's what we tend to see. We tend to see guys who panic in this range, exit in front of Andrew's hands, drop their hands to their waistline to recover a weapon, backpedal while doing so, and usually this is the moment where we see a lot of knockouts and a lot of falls. Generally speaking, the safer way to exit the clinch is to get behind him first. So if we think about the empty hand problem, like Andrew just simulated that punch he was giving me, obviously, if I backpedal and drop my hands, I can easily get knocked out here, okay? If this were a knife problem that I were dealing with, okay, let's say Andrew had this knife in his hand, this training knife, and I were trying to keep him from sticking me, okay? And it sounds good to say break range and get to the pistol, but it's kind of the same problem. If I concede control of this hand, all Andrew's gonna do is run me down and Singer sewing machine me as I'm pawing wildly for my pistol. If this were a gun that we were fighting over, if Andrew will make a finger gun, I'll show you what I'm talking about. Let's say he's got this shoved down into his waistband. He's trying to pull this out. I'm trying to keep him from pulling out. I have a weapon. The problem is he's established grip on his first. And if I exit in front of the hands, I'm in a 1-foot slugfest and there's nowhere to go. At least if we get behind him first, what that does is for him to mount any kind of effective attack, it forces him to turn, which allows me time to recover some initiative. So generally speaking, and there are exceptions to every rule, the safest way to escape the clinch is to get behind the person first. Basically, what keeps me from just running around to Andrew's back or his arms, and I'm going to teach you 2 ways to manage the arms so you can get behind him. We're going to go under the arm, and we're going to call that particular escape a duck under. Or we're going to move the arm far enough across his body where I can now step around it, and we're going to call that technique an arm drag. So let's start with the duck under first. When we execute this technique, what we're going to do is we're going to do this from a position we either think of as a wrist tie, where I'm grabbing Andrew's wrist, or we're going to do this from what we think of as an underhook, where I go under the armpit and I attach up here around Andrew's shoulder. What this is going to involve me doing is doing what we think of as a level change, which is where I'm going to squat and look up, not bend and look down. That's a critical piece of information so we don't get our head caught, picked up, dumped, guillotined, what have you. So I'm going to squat and look up on the underhook side. As I do that, I'm going to punch my arm to the sky almost like Superman taking off back in the old 50s TV show, okay? So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to squat and look up just like so, to clear Andrew's arm. Now, as I do that, the next thing I'm going to do once I clear the arm is I'm going to establish waist control. I do that for a couple of reasons. Number one, by establishing some semblance of waist control, what I can do is I can control Andrew's posture. Secondly, by establishing waist control around the belt line, if Andrew has not drawn a weapon yet, it makes it much harder for him to do so as I'm working my way around to get to his back so I can't escape. I'm going to do that via a body lock, some variation of a body lock, where I squat and look up, shut the arm, take this position here. I'm going to work my way around in such a way to where I'm behind him, breaking his posture as I do so, and now I'll attempt an exit. If I can't exit, maybe I'll deploy a weapon from here, but obviously the back position with some semblance of limb control is a much better place to be than in front of his hands. So the duck under is the first route, the first pathway to the back. The second pathway to the back is what we think of as the arm drag. So when I do this, I'm going to pull this from a wrist tie. This is a pendulum motion where I'm going to bring this to my center line, transfer right above the elbow at the tricep, and drag this arm across my body. As I do that, what I'm going to do is take control of his hip, step into him deep, and make my body lock and do the same thing. Work my way around until I'm behind him, okay? So, duck under off the underhook side. Duck under off the wrist tie side, lifting the arm up, looking up, working my way around. And then finally, the alternative strategy or the alternative technique of the arm drag, pulling to center, grabbing Andrew's hip, working around him, and taking the position there. Okay, we're going to talk about retaining your weapon in the clinch. More than likely, if you have a weapons retention problem, it's not going to be out here. It's probably going to be at some point of attachment where we have this mad tangle of limbs, striking. That's usually where the gun grab happens. I'm going to show you two different positions, the appendix position, and I'm just going to work the traditional strong side hip position. But controlling the hands is really where it's at when it comes to keeping his hands off the gun. It's really, really important that these hands stay away from my waist and stay away from his waist. So when we use wrestling to develop this, we really have a strong preference for playing what we think of as an underhook arm tie game. We'll start from the traditional strong side hip position first. So I'm just going to take this gun and stick it in my pants. What we're going to do is we're going to secure the gun with a technique that we think of as an elbow pin. What I'm going to do is take the inside of my elbow, I'm going to pin Andrew's hand to the gun and then pin both his gun, or excuse me, my gun and his hand into my hip. I'll do that by level changing. So I'm going to pin this in here, okay, and I'm going to squat and really force him to support my weight. And a good analogy here is the old cartoon where the little monkey stuck his hand in the bottle and he's trying to get something out. There's no way he should be able to get his hand out while it's made into a fist and he's holding something. The only way for him to get his hand loose is he's going to have to relax his hand. So that's what I'm shooting for. I'm going to take head position on him and use my head as a wedge. The other thing I'm going to do with this hand is I'm going to take an attachment over here, either a wrist tie or a bicep tie, because more than likely this is not a gun grab in isolation. He's probably grabbed the pistol and he's wailing on me with that other hand. This is the position for the elbow pin, just like so, here. Now, I didn't even have a holster on, okay? Andrew's a relatively young, strong guy. Would pull that gun and tell me if it feels secure.
Yep, super secure.
Okay, so that's not gonna go anywhere even without a holster. Again, it's a very, very, very solid technique, especially for a smaller person. For the appendix carry position, we're gonna do the same thing with slight modification. When he grabs, it's still gonna be an elbow pin. I'm gonna come around here around the side panel of the pistol. When I do this, I'm going to take this hand, I'm going to form a figure 4 grip, just like so. I'm going to hang my weight forward and put all of that weight on top of his hands, okay? And you can see what that's doing to his posture, okay? It's really dropping him down, and I'm hanging all my weight. I'm keeping my elbows in when I do this, forcing an effective pin so the gun can't come out of the holster. That's the first step, is that the gun doesn't get immediately torn out of the holster. We secure the pistol into the holster with the elbow pin. Got to do something with that. So what am I going to do? I'm going to really wreck and damage this grabbing arm. Here's how I'm going to do that. So we'll start from strong side hip again. He's got the gun grab. I've secured with the elbow pin. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make this arm vulnerable by getting it away from his body more. The way I'm going to do that is I'm going to use some footwork. I'm going to level change and load my hip. What this looks like footwork wise is kind of like me dropping into a lunge. All right, so from here I'm going to level change and load my hip, and if you notice how that extends his arm, that's what I'm looking for. The next thing I'm going to do is release this, support my grip, and turn my torso mass across Andrew's elbow here. Okay, now if this doesn't have the desired effect of making him release, I will follow that up with a hook and come across the other side and punch him in the face. So very simple technique. Same idea from the appendix carry position, just like so. From here, I've got my elbow pin. I will level change and load. I will turn this violently up against his elbow. And again, if that doesn't have the desired effect, I will come across and hit him with a hook or an elbow or an overhand. So very simple technique, very damaging technique, very violent technique. And I will just cycle back and forth between wrecking his arm and punching him in the face until he stops grabbing my gun. All right, guys, we're going to talk about deploying a pistol inside of a clinch, or what we think of as an entanglement. Historically, the strategy for extreme close range shooting was to use combatives, hand technique, what have you, to make space to get to the gun. And that strategy most assuredly does work, and it has been successful. However, sometimes there's nowhere to go. Sometimes you can't release from the clinch. So let's look at the viability of drawing the pistol inside of this range. Before I go for this pistol, the limb of the adversary closest to the gun somehow, some way, has to be out of control and out of the way. So let's think about this for a second. Let's say I were to get to a relatively safe, relatively dominant position, such as the combination of an underhook and an arm tie. I'm on the flank, I have good head position. Pretty safe for the time being. If I were to release Andrew's arm to come down here to grab my gun, that's probably what he's going to do. He's just going to chase it there. So the problem has been the timing of my presentation and the control of my presentation. So this limb is the issue. Greco-Roman wrestling in particular provides a lot of good pathways to be able to ensure this successful presentation. For example, a technique we think of as a mouse trap or a split seat belt, where I thread around the hip, capture this arm, grab the pistol. Now this limb is out of the way and I can ensure a successful deployment. Okay, so, or using some of the previously mentioned escape techniques like an arm drag or a duck under, where my head is on the underhook side. I will lift this up. Now this limb is out of control. I'll establish my body lock. Now I can draw this pistol. Timing, that's the first rule here. Notice when I do draw the pistol, I'm drawing the pistol into a position we think of and call a thumb pectoral index. A thumb pectoral index is a retention shooting position with a downward angle. The downward angle is incredibly important, so I deconflict the support hand and what's going on where it's doing its good work. If I were to have this mouse trap here, this position, I've established timing, I'm good to go on drawing the gun, and I were to draw the gun and drop my elbow, obviously we can see a real problem here with the angle. So when we shoot in this kind of space, it's incredibly important that we deconflict the pistol and the support hand, and the best way to do that is to take this downward angle first. Now, obviously these are not A-zone shots. However, personally, I think of shooting with any kind of entanglement primarily as diminishment. The shooting assists me in releasing, getting space where I can get to my sights and use the pistol the way it was designed to be used, as a distance versus a contact tool. So, diminishment, that's how we want to think of all this shooting. Problems that we have here are timing, traditionally, in drawing the pistol. The second issue we see with entangled presentations is what we think of as floating the gun. Now, what does that mean? Floating the gun, let's say I were to get into a pretty dominant position here, this mouse trap, and I were to deploy the pistol, Maybe Andrew sees that, doesn't want to get shot, and starts running behind me. This is what I mean by floating the gun. So I'm breaking this thumb pectoral index and chasing him with the pistol. Minor problem we have is with the gun far away from my body, the gun is way less retainable. If I lose control of his hand, he gets on it, it's much easier for him to get back to him versus me. That's a minor problem. Here's a major problem with floating the gun. When you float the gun, if Andrew were to move behind me and do something like this, you are shooting from a position that is neither on your sights nor kinesthetically referenced through a ton of repetition as we do in formal training. And here's what tends to happen. What tends to happen when people float the gun as Andrew moves behind me is they will shoot everyone else that's watching the training and miss this guy completely. And you wouldn't think that would happen, but it's very, very common. And when it happens, you know, it's mildly entertaining, but let's look at the reality here. You're sending rounds out into the public. That's not acceptable. So how do we mitigate that? We don't float the gun. When I feel someone moving away from me, I'm gonna turn myself into the shot. So basically, I am like a tank, the gun is like a turret, and I'm moving myself into the shot versus breaking the thumb pectoral index and floating it towards him. We see this a lot with guys who get their back taken. So maybe Andrew has gotten behind me, terrible place for me to be. Maybe he caught me with gun in hand and we're fighting over the gun. We see people do all kinds of crazy things like that, or that, or that, okay? Not hit the guy they're entangled with, send a round off in the public, or even worse, shoot themselves. So I still have to solve the positional problem first. I still have to turn into him, and I still have to abide by good timing and not floating the gun. These are the two elements that ensures a successful entangled presentation. The clinch, probably the most alive range of combat. He can touch me, I can touch him. We can pick each other up, we can grab each other. He can deploy his weapons, he can grab mine, I can grab mine. We can punch, we can strike, everything is in play. Incredibly dangerous place to be. Primary strategy is to exit that clinch. The best way to do so is to get behind him first. Two ways to do that: the duck under and the arm drag. Again, channeling Greco-Roman wrestling is viable strategies for getting behind someone. There's a good chance he might end up grabbing something on you. So retaining your weapons, particularly your handgun, in both the appendix and the strong side position, incredibly important. We have a primary technique of an elbow pin that we'll use to stabilize the pistol inside the holster, with a primary strategy of an arm destruction following into striking. Deploying the pistol inside of the clinch, very, very, very tricky proposition. The two primary issues are timing and not floating the gun. Our timing rule that we've established is we must somehow, some way, control the limb of the adversaries closest to the gun before deploying that pistol. Once the pistol is deployed, we want to make sure we're shooting from a downward angle to deconflict what the support hand is doing to keep ourselves clear. As we do that, we want to make sure that we are turning into him and not floating the gun and possibly sending rounds off into the public, sending rounds off into wherever, hitting yourself. Very messy place to shoot from. So, guys, this is a really dangerous place to work. It's a tricky place. It's the intersection of combatives and pistol work. So I would recommend that you spend some time examining this area. It's a niche area. Most gunfights aren't entangled, but if it goes that way, that's a very messy place to be. Get some quality Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, get some quality wrestling, find a subject matter expert in this area that can tie this content in together. If you can't do that, then probably just get a couple of buddies, get some blue guns, get out there, put some boxing gloves on, pressure test this content, and see what works. Guys, I'm Craig Douglas on behalf of SureFire. Thank you so much for joining me. Hope to see you out there on the range.